Sara's Song, Crazy for You Book 2, written by Sandra Edwards, narrated by Desiree Brajvich. Prologue. Fall, 1984, London. Sara Bronson turned as her husband Kirk said to her, "I've done something you're not gonna like." His declaration was accompanied by his guilt-ridden face and set Sara's senses on edge. "What?" The inquiry tumbled out on her shaky voice. "I don't know why I did it. I didn't mean to." He defended his mistake, whatever it was. "What did you do?" Sara asked softly. "I never wanted to hurt you." He shook his head. "But this is going to." "What did you do?" Sara's frustration echoed out in her tone. "They were all talking at once, hassling us, trying to catch us off guard." "Who?" "The press." "Kirk, just tell me what happened." "Well, you know how much Roxanne doesn't want Frank to know about her baby." Not those two again. It was bad enough that Sara had to live in the outskirts of Roxanne Simon and Frank Garrett's insane world for more months than she cared to remember, and all because Kirk had starred in a movie with Roxanne. Sara's frustration turned to fear. "What did you do?" She repeated the question, barely above a whisper. Kirk was trying to say something, but he only managed to get out the first bit of a word that she couldn't make out, and it seemed to grind on his voice. He shook his head, and that kick-started him talking. He came from out of nowhere and called her by her real name. Kirk had been with Roxanne Simon in L.A. for the premiere of their movie, The Secret. Sara hadn't gone because she'd had the flu. "I told them I was Frankie's father." "Why would you do that?" Sara's voice delivered the inquiry in a surprisingly calm manner, considering the implication had her heart pounding furiously against her chest. "Everything happened so quickly." Kirk stood there, looking like a deer caught in the headlights. "It was the guy who'd called her by her real name. He mentioned Frank Garrett and asked if he'd seen the baby. I knew she didn't want him to know, so I just said it." He gave an impromptu shrug and shook his head. "It came from out of nowhere." 6 months later. Sara didn't understand why Kirk had come to the penthouse to deliver the news. She knew the divorce was final. She didn't need him to tell her that. But there he was, standing just inside the living room door. Now her living room. It used to be theirs. Not anymore. "There's no reason why we have to part as enemies," he said, as if he wanted her to let him off the hook. Like that was going to happen. "We can't be friends," she said with little emotion. "I never betrayed you." She looked up at him, hatred burning her eyes. "You betrayed me in the worst possible way, Kirk." "Someday." He had this distant, faraway look in his brown eyes. "You'll get your song, Sara." He shook his head and reached for the door. "I'm just not the one to sing it to you. I don't know the words." To Sara, that meant he hadn't really loved her. Not like he'd loved Roxanne Simon, obviously. Sara's consolation prize for coming in second wasn't exactly chopped liver. In the divorce, the courts had awarded Sara half of Kirk's current and future earnings on all of his music to date. At the age of 27, Sara Robbins, formerly Bronson, was starting over. This time, she swore it'd turn out differently. This time, she was going to find her song, one that no one else could take away from her. Chapter 1. August 1986, Fireside, California. Sara wasn't the sort of person to run from her troubles, but after nearly 2 years of being hounded by the press over her husband, make that ex-husband's, very public yet faux indiscretion, leaving England seemed like the only way she'd get any peace. She'd deserted the last name Bronson in favor of her maiden name, Robbins, in hopes that she'd actually stand a chance at hiding out in the States for a while. She'd thought about writing a book or something. Then again, Roxanne Simon had done that while she was hiding from Frank Garrett, and look how that turned out. Sara had quickly nixed that idea. Instead, she'd opted to pull out her cameras and go back to the world of photography. That's how she'd met Kirk. She'd been hired to do a photo shoot with his band. In light of how that had turned out, she intended to steer clear of high-profile photo shoots. In an effort to keep a low profile, she'd applied for and won a position as a photographer at a newspaper in a sleepy little town tucked away in the Sierra Nevada mountains called Fireside, California. Not that she needed the money. She'd gotten plenty from Kirk. But she didn't want to end up as one of those shut-ins that all the neighbors called crazy. She needed to keep busy, to preoccupy herself with something. And taking pictures, well, that's what she knew. Settling into Fireside, population 7,792, had been easy. Sara had rented and settled into an apartment that was located about 2 miles outside the city limits. The 6-month lease afforded her plenty of time to figure out if she wanted to hang around Fireside for a while. If she did, in a couple of months she'd start checking out houses. Hopefully she'd find one that suited her, and she could put down some actual roots. Fireside was secluded and quiet and tucked away in a thick forest, and quite unlike anything Sara was used to in London. She was scheduled to start work on Monday, and she was going to enjoy the scenic solitude of the daily drive to and from the paper. She'd been in Fireside 3 weeks now, and she'd yet to see it rain. She couldn't ever remember this much time passing in London without rain. But her neighbors had told her she'd see plenty of precipitation in the winter, in the form of snow. Something else she wasn't used to. She turned right off Embers Lane, her street, and headed east toward town. A hill, one long stretch, and 2 curves, and Sara would pass the city limits sign. Near the end of the stretch, she caught sight of a newly placed sign on the right side of the road. Bold colors in red, white, and blue proclaimed, "Justin Walraven for Congress." After the first curve, another sign, same colors, but a different design, declared that, "A vote for Mickey Darlington is a vote for progress." Sara shook her head. She was glad she didn't have the right to vote in this country, and she wondered if voting was as useless here as it was in England. At 29, Sara, like most young people, wasn't interested in politics. As Sara rounded the second curve, a deer darted across the road. Clay Darlington motored the fire department truck along Highway 49, heading back toward Fireside. He'd been in Oakhurst, to the high school down there, overseeing a fire and earthquake drill. No one else at the department had wanted to go, but Clay didn't mind. He liked being out and about, soaking up the beauty of the countryside that he'd called home for most of his life. He'd run into Tim Weaver while he was there. Clay and Tim used to play together at USC back in the day. Tim was the high school's coach now. The NFL had shown some interest in Tim, but they were hem-hawing and Tim needed a job pronto because his girlfriend was pregnant. In the end, Tim had stayed in Oakhurst, and the NFL became a dream that slipped further and further away until it drifted completely out of sight. Tim Jr. was 13 now, and Tim Sr. had proudly declared that his son was showing some talent for the game. Even at 35, Clay couldn't imagine being the father of a teenager. Still, he wondered what would have happened if he and Meredith had had a child. Someone else would be raising his child, that's what. He offered up a silent prayer of thanks for dodging the nightmare of being tied to Meredith forever. The road was quiet today, not much traffic as Clay neared the outskirts of Fireside. Embers Lane represented the 2-mile mark, or thereabouts, to the city limits. He checked his watch. 10:45. Maybe after he got back to the station, he'd volunteer to make a lunch run. Anything to get back out of doors. Rounding the first of 2 curves before the city limits sign, Clay spotted the deer lying in the middle of his lane. He braked and rolled off to the shoulder of the road, hitting his emergency lights before stepping out of the truck. He checked the deer. It was dead. And it needed to be moved before it caused a wreck. Just when he'd decided to get his gloves from the truck and move it, he took particular notice of the skid marks. They were fresh, and ended on the side of the road where he'd parked his truck. He looked at the deer, but quickly decided he'd waited long enough to check the ravine. The vehicle that had hit the deer had probably moved on down the road, but he needed to make sure that's what happened. If a car or truck was down in the ravine, somebody was almost certainly hurt, hopefully not too badly. On the other side of the truck, he saw the break in the fledgling trees lining the roadside. Moving in closer, he spotted the car about 50 feet down in the ravine, lying upside down. Holy shit! He yanked open the passenger door and grabbed the radio mic. After talking to Chip at the station, he tossed the mic onto the seat and scaled the side of the hill like he'd been doing it all his life. Clay dropped to the ground beside the upside-down sports car and peered inside. A woman. Blonde hair hung in her face, and she looked lifeless. The impact had shattered the windshield and windows. Clay reached inside and checked her neck for a pulse. It was there, and strong. She must have been knocked out during the rollover. Clay brushed her hair out of her face, checking for injuries. A few scrapes, nothing serious. Thank goodness. At least she wouldn't have a disfigured face to contend with, on top of any other injuries she might have sustained. She moaned and her eyes fluttered open. "What?" she muttered, taking in her surroundings. "Somebody, help me, please." Her words, spoken in a British accent, tapered off as her voice faded. "It's okay, sweetheart." He used his charismatic voice, the one he'd quickly learned in college could charm the girls to do his bidding. This time he used it, hoping to keep her from going into shock. "I'm right here with you. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." "There was a deer." She sounded scared, rightfully so. "Did I hurt it?" She was worried about the deer. Clay's heart melted a little. "No, the deer's fine," he lied. "What's your name?" "Sara," she said. "Well, Sara, my name is Clay, and I'm with the Fireside Fire and Rescue." He kept the charm flowing, hoping it would do its job of calming her. She reached up, feeling for him. He wrapped his hand gently around hers. "My buddies are going to be here real soon, and we're going to get you out of here." "Am I going to die?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He said, "Not if I can help it." And she laughed a little. He told her, "You just hang on to me and everything will be fine." Relief washed over Clay at the sound of the sirens approaching, but he remained cool and collected, for her sake. She needed to remain calm and not drift off into shock. Clay stood in front of his truck, staring in the direction where the ambulance had driven off. He hoped the girl would be okay. Maybe he'd go check on her later. Troy Johnson, the rookie of the bunch, trudged up the hillside carrying a women's handbag. "Hey, Cap," he said to Clay. "What do you want us to do with her purse?" Clay waved him over and took the purse. "I'll get it to her." He looked at the bag, but didn't open it. Instead, he looked back at Johnson. "Did you check her wallet for an emergency contact?" Troy Johnson shook his head and slowly lowered his gaze, like he knew he'd screwed up. "Don't worry about it, Johnson," Clay said with a carefree air to ease Johnson's worries. "I'll take care of it." Clay went around to the driver's side of his truck, climbed in, and began scanning the contents of Sarah's wallet to see if he could find emergency contact info. Her name was Sara Renee Robbins. She owned an international driver's license with an address in London. She was also in possession of a passport. Her contact information was for her parents, in Balcombe, United Kingdom. Curious. Very curious indeed. What was Sara Renee Robbins, a Londoner, doing here in this little town of Fireside, California, tucked high in the hills of the Sierra Nevada, a place you needed to be looking for to find? People just didn't stumble upon Fireside by accident. Chapter 2. The next morning, Clay made the drive down to Fresno, where Sara Robbins had been transported to the hospital. He'd called yesterday, but they'd told him she'd be staying overnight for observation, and she'd probably be more coherent if he'd wait 24 hours before trying to see her. For that reason, he'd opted not to reach out to her emergency contact. Her parents were, after all, in England, and realistically, by the time they made it to Fireside, Sara would most likely be out of the hospital. Nope. He'd leave the choice to contact her parents up to her. Walking through the corridors of the hospital, Clay carried Sarah's purse inside a paper bag. He was secure in his manhood, but toting a woman's purse around, especially in public, would test that. He reached the room that had the name Sarah Robbins on the plaque outside it. He paused, then tapped gently before opening the door. Clay stepped into the room. The television was on, but with no volume. She was staring at it. Instantly, her eyes cut to him. She checked him out warily. Wanting to put her at ease, Clay smiled and was about to introduce himself when she said, "You were at the accident site yesterday, weren't you?" "Yes." He stepped closer to her bedside. "I found you. I arrived not long after it happened." She sucked in a breath and looked away from him. "You lied." "I lied?" She glanced back at him. "You said the deer was okay." He nodded. "Yes, I did, but in my defense, I was more worried about you than the deer." "They say you saved my life." There was something new in her tone, something that suggested she was grateful, yet unsure if she deserved the consideration. "I'm just glad to see you're okay." He shrugged, then remembered that he had her bag. "Oh, I have your purse. I thought you might need it." Her face relaxed at the mention of it. "Thank you." She pushed herself up into a sitting position and reached for the bag. She pulled out her purse and hugged it. "My whole life is in here. Without it, I'd be sunk." "Glad I could help." She gave him a frightful look. "You didn't call my parents, did you?" He almost chuckled. "No," he shook his head. "The hospital said you'd be okay. I thought it best to let you handle that." "Thank you again." She let her angst rumble out in a hint of laughter. "I didn't want to worry them needlessly." "And I don't want them showing up here. Needlessly." She laughed a little, but he got the feeling that her parents showing up was the worst thing that could happen. Sarah's parents hadn't wanted her to leave England in the first place, and she didn't want them showing up now. Luckily, this guy— "What was your name again?" she asked. "Clay." His smile had a way of putting her at ease. "Clay Darlington." Darlington? Man, that sounded familiar. If her head didn't hurt so badly, she might be able to figure it out. Maybe later. "Well, Clay Darlington, my name is—" "Sarah," he said, cutting her off. Sarah's questioning face must have alerted him to her uncertainty over how he knew her name. Her purse. Of course. He'd probably gone through her wallet looking for emergency contact info. Thank God she'd replaced Kirk's name with her parents'. That's all she needed. Somebody finding out she was once married to and subsequently betrayed by the famous rock star. "You told me your name at the accident site," Clay said, bringing her back to the here and now. "That's right," she nodded, appreciating the fact that he wasn't throwing it in her face that he'd probably, most likely, gone through her wallet. The door swung open and a nurse carrying a clipboard walked in, smiling. "I have good news, Miss Robbins." She moved to Sarah's bedside. "Dr. Adams has signed your release papers. You're free to go after I tie up the paperwork." How long will that be?" Sarah asked, weaker than she'd anticipated. She wasn't sure where Fresno was, much less how she was going to get home. "It shouldn't take more than 15 or 20 minutes," the nurse said, retreating toward the door. "I'll be back to take you down in a wheelchair as soon as everything's settled." After the nurse left, Clay asked, "Is there someone I can call for you?" Sarah shrugged. "A taxi, apparently." She should make it a point to make friends in Fireside. And where was she going to buy a new car? And how was she going to get there? "I'm new in town. I don't really know anyone." "I'll give you a ride back to Fireside," he offered. "I wouldn't want to put you out," she said, all the while hoping his offer was sincere. She could use the ride. Not that she couldn't afford a taxi, thanks to Kirk's money, which was now her money. But catching a ride with Clay seemed like a lot more fun, him being her personal hero and all. "In Fireside, we take care of our own." "I do appreciate the ride," she nodded. "But I don't really qualify as one of you. I'm new to Fireside." Clay sat down in the chair by her bed. "I've been meaning to ask you, how did you come to be in our little town? It's not like we're the talk of England." He chuckled. "A job. A photographer at the paper." Sara shrugged, feeling a little helpless. "Which I'm probably going to lose because how can I take pictures with my bum shoulder in this sling?" "Like I said, we take care of our own." Clay gave her a reassuring nod. "I'm sure Harvey will understand." Harvey? He was on first-name terms with her boss? Maybe soon-to-be ex-boss? "I sure hope so." She bit into her bottom lip. "I really wanted that job." "It'll be fine. You'll see." He said it like he really believed it. Sara wished she could. But damn, she no longer had a car, and maybe not even a job. This wasn't the best way to start her life over. Chapter 3. Clay strolled into Ruby's diner right around 7 the next morning and spotted Harvey Thompson sitting at the counter, just the man he wanted to see. Harvey and his wife Mary Beth owned and operated the Fireside News, the town's newspaper. Clay ambled up to the counter and claimed the empty seat next to Harvey. "Clay," Harvey said, then sipped his coffee. "Harvey." Clay propped his elbows on the counter. "How the hell are you?" "Not bad, not bad." He set his cup down and turned to Clay. "You?" "Pretty quiet. Not a lot going on." He gave Jewel, the waitress, a smile as she turned over his coffee cup and filled it. "I pulled that photographer you hired out of her mangled car the other day." "Yeah." Harvey's interest perked up. "She called last night. Said she'd been in a wreck." He shrugged. "Said she needed a few days to recover before she could start." Harvey turned to Clay. "She wasn't hurt too bad, was she?" Clay shook his head. "She'll recover. It could have been worse." "Good. My wife likes her pictures." The worst part about getting a new car, for Sara anyway, was going to be learning to drive on the wrong side of the car. Never mind the wrong side of the road. The perks, however, were being accompanied to the car dealership in Fresno by the incredibly handsome Clay Darlington, and spending Kirk's money to buy herself a brand new Corvette. Sara was going American all the way. It had been a week since Sara had been released from the hospital. A few scratches that were practically healed already, and a dislocated shoulder were the extent of the injuries she'd gotten from the rollover that destroyed her car. Sara was lucky, they'd said. She tended to agree. Clay had graciously offered to drive her to a car dealership in Fresno, where he said she'd get the best deal. On the drive in, Sara had wondered about Clay, trying to sneak a peek at his left hand, but always at a disadvantage to get a good look at his ring finger. Clay was incredibly handsome. Dark hair, gray eyes, rugged good looks. Exactly the opposite of Kirk Bronson. That was definitely a plus. The fire and rescue uniform fit him like it had been tailor-made for him. The t-shirt's fabric molded over his biceps and clung to his chest. Damn, he was in good shape. They cruised along Highway 49. Clay rested his forearm on the driver door window frame and steered with one hand, while making small talk with her about the kind of car she wanted to buy. Sara was surprised by the heat stirring in her belly, just from listening to him talk. Clay found out that buying a car was incredibly simple when you were paying with cash. Sara had bought herself a brand new Corvette, laying down a check for the full amount. She must have made good money as a photographer in England, and he had to wonder why she'd settled for the little more than peanuts that the Fireside Times could pay. When he'd left her at the dealership, she'd joked about having to drive on the wrong side of the car now, in addition to the wrong side of the road. She laughed about it, but he got the feeling she was a little more than apprehensive about it. But her shoulder was better. "Barely sore at all anymore," she'd said. He'd told her he was confident that she could make the drive. Later that afternoon, he drove past the Sierra View apartments, where Sara lived, just to make sure she'd made it home okay. Her car was in the parking lot, bright blue, shiny and new, and not a scratch on it. Clay fought the urge to stop, and cruised on past, forcing himself to head back to town, to the firehouse. 3 days later, on Monday, Sara had gotten up extra early to prepare for her first day at work as a photographer for the Fireside Times. On the drive into town, she winced as she passed the spot. She could tell where it was because it was just after the Mickey Darlington sign. Mickey Darlington. Could it be? Was she related or, God forbid, married to Clay? That thought left a nasty feeling settling heavily in Sara's gut. She tried to push it aside with thoughts of food. Since arriving in Fireside several weeks ago, Sara had dropped into Ruby's diner a few times. Everybody said it was the place for breakfast. So today she pulled into the parking lot at 7:10 a.m., ready to join in the local tradition. She cut the engine, grabbed her purse, and opened the car door. As she stepped out onto the gravel lot, she glanced up into the smoldering gray eyes of Clay Darlington. Clay! Sara didn't do a very good job of hiding her surprise or her delight at seeing him so unexpectedly. Morning, Sara. He dazzled her with a smile that showed the slightest hint of dimples. You're adjusting to driving on the wrong side of the car, I see. He chuckled and crossed his hands at his chest. Yeah. She nodded, less than confident. So far, so good. You'll be fine. He said it like he believed it. Thanks to you. She rolled her eyes, unable to believe she was acting so goofy. He was just a man, for Pete's sake. Granted, a scrumptious man, but a man nonetheless, and in the end they were all nothing but trouble. But damn, he was easy on the eyes. She glanced at his hands, his left one draped around his arm. No ring. But that didn't mean anything. So, I was thinking, she said, knowing she shouldn't, but she didn't stop herself. I really need to find some way to thank you for all you've done for me. How about I take you and your wife out to dinner? She fished for information, ever so cleverly, she thought. But he laughed. I don't have a wife. Mischief sparkled in his eyes. Okay, so Mickey Darlington wasn't his wife. She could be an ex, but Sara had better worry about the here and now at this point and agonize over the past later, Sara supposed. Girlfriend? He shook his head and showed his dimples again. Boyfriend? She asked, turning the tables on him. Very funny. His gray eyes narrowed. A hot flush crept up Sara's neck and over her face. She glanced away. Clay cleared his throat and said, How about I pick you up tonight at 6:30? We'll drive into Fresno and grab a bite. Clay arrived at Sara's place at 6:25 p.m. He was prompt, something Kirk could never claim. Sara's ex-husband would probably be late for his own funeral. Clay walked her outside to a vintage red Corvette. Every bit the gentleman, he opened the passenger door for her. She basked in his attention as she slid down into the car's bucket seat. Sara watched him trot around to the driver's side and climb in. Nice car, she said as he shut the door. Well, it's not new like yours, he teased her with a wink, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life. Your car is better than mine, she said. 1963 Stingray, the only year that featured the split rear window. How'd you know that? He looked at her with smiling eyes that said he was impressed. You'd be surprised at the things I know. She laughed a little, feeling elated that she had impressed Clay. She looked back at him. I'd like to photograph you in the car. Me? He asked warily. Sure, why not? She ran her hand admiringly over the dashboard. This is a great machine. Sara knew half a dozen magazines she could sell the photographs to, but that could bring attention to her. She didn't want that. She'd just do a layout for Clay. It'd be a nice thank you gift for everything he'd done for her. Clay took Sara to a little Mexican restaurant in Fresno that was more suited to locals than tourists. The hostess seated them at a booth in the back near an indoor fountain. Sara ordered a strawberry margarita, Clay a beer, Corona. While they perused the menu and waited for their drinks, Sara dug into her purse and pulled out a handful of coins and offered Clay a penny. He took it. What's this for? Make a wish, throw it in the fountain. She went silent and looked at the fountain for a moment, then tossed in the coin. Clay wondered what she'd wished for. She raked her shoulder-length blonde hair behind her ear and looked at him eagerly, waiting for him to follow suit. Clay didn't know why he didn't just toss the coin into the fountain and tell her he'd made a wish. He wasn't in the habit of making wishes, especially not ones that required tossing a coin into a fountain. Even so, he found himself silently wishing that Sara wouldn't turn out to be like Meredith. After that, giving the coin an underhanded toss into the fountain seemed like the thing to do. Moments later, the waitress delivered their drinks. Sara's brown eyes brightened as she sipped hers. The girl was gorgeous beyond words. She had the face of an angel, and it was framed by these silky blonde strands of hair that he wanted to knot up in his hands. Whoa, easy there, big fella. He coached himself not to get too carried away by this girl. He didn't even know her. Not really. The waitress stopped at their table and stood over them. Her presence pulled Clay out of his private thoughts. Are you ready to order? The waitress asked. For dinner, Sara chose a seafood enchilada plate, and Clay decided on the steak fajitas. After the waitress walked away, Clay grabbed his beer and looked deep into Sara's eyes. So, Sara, what brings you to our little hideout here in the mountains? He found himself falling back into her sea of intrigue. She was temptingly beautiful and mysterious, and Clay wanted to know why she was here. Surely you could have gotten a job in a more prominent city, like LA or New York. Either one would have paid better. Sure, New York or LA would have paid more, but those are hectic lifestyles, Sara shrugged, and I'm just not interested in that. I'm looking for quiet and laid back. Well, you found that here. Have you lived here all your life? Mostly, Clay nodded. I went away to college. Thought I'd chase the bright lights for a while. That didn't work out so well. Oh? She sipped her drink and eyed him curiously. He'd probably said too much. He was usually good about avoiding that sort of thing. But Sara had a way of making him want to chat with her, tell her everything about his life before her. Most women, whether they followed football or not, knew who Clay was. Well, the American ones, anyway. He'd been on the list of Modern California magazine's most eligible bachelors all 4 years he'd played in the NFL. Since he'd met Sara, he couldn't tell if she knew who he was or not, but he quickly decided that her being from England probably meant that she didn't. For once, Clay realized that with Sara, he didn't have to worry about why she liked him. Of course, in this instance, it might have had something to do with the fact that he'd saved her life, but at least it wasn't because of his former pseudo-celebrity status. He'd fallen into that trap before, and it hadn't turned out well. He'd tell her about it someday, just not today. Clay seemed to be getting antsy. The last thing Sara wanted was to make him feel uncomfortable. When she decided to come to America, she'd told herself that she wouldn't get involved with anyone, but she'd only enforced that rule upon herself because she didn't want a repeat of Kirk Bronson. But Clay couldn't be more different than Kirk. Clay was a small-town guy with a regular job. He led a simple life, and he liked it. Wasn't that what Sara was looking for? In that moment, Sara decided to see where this attraction between herself and Clay might take them. The waitress brought their dinners, and she vowed not to ask him anything too personal tonight. He'd tell her his secrets when he was ready. She cut into her food and asked, So, how long have you been a firefighter? She looked up at him. That is the correct term, right? He nodded and gave her a reassuring smile. About 10 years. I went away to school and came back to Fireside when I was 25. He paused, loading a tortilla with steak and fajita fixings. How old are you, Sara? Having just been told that he was roughly 35, Sara had no qualms about saying, I'm 29. That didn't seem to bother him, and she was glad. She'd often wondered if Kirk had been so taken with Roxanne Simon because she was younger. Only by a few years, but every year counts when your husband publicly claims, falsely, to be the father of another woman's child. Sara's single wish was to never live another humiliating moment such as that again. It was a moment that wouldn't go away. That was the hardest part. and the reason she'd come to this place here, nestled clandestinely in the Sierra Nevada mountains. "Well, you certainly don't look 29, he winked at her. "I was wondering if you were even 21. She knew he was lying, but she didn't care. He was doing it to please her, not some other woman, so it was all good. "You are very charming," she said, trying to hang on to what little sanity she had left. He laughed and said, "I try." They finished their dinners while exchanging idle chit-chat and the occasional flirting banter. When dinner was over and Clay had paid the bill, they headed toward the front of the restaurant. "So do you think you might like to go with me to the movies tomorrow evening?" He laid his hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd at the restaurant's entrance. She liked his touch, as casual as it was. She felt like he was somehow protecting her and claiming her all at the same time. Sara loved the attention she was getting from Clay. "Yes." She glanced at him, feeling suddenly more attractive and alluring. "I'd like that very much." They were interrupted by a passing stranger. Sara knew that Clay didn't know the man who'd stopped at his side because of the puzzled way Clay looked at him. "Clay Darlington, right?" The man pointed at Clay. "Man, you were one of the greatest running backs to play the game." This guy was awfully excited about something, but Sara hadn't a clue what. "Thank you." Clay shook his hand. "I don't get recognized much these days. Out of sight, out of mind." He laughed it off. "Are you kidding me?" The guy reached for his wife. "Honey, is your camera in your purse?" Honey nodded, looking at Clay with star-struck eyes. Sara had seen that look before, when women gazed at Kirk, but this was ridiculous. Clay was no celebrity, was he? "Do you mind?" the overzealous fan asked. "I'd love to get a picture with you." "Not a problem," Clay said, then suggested, "Here, let's get the hostess to snap the photo so the ladies can join us in the picture." Sara's heart pounded in her chest, and then fell to the floor. A photograph? Really? And who the hell was Clay that some stranger would walk up to him in a restaurant asking to take a picture with him? Chapter 4. Sara had clammed up after the picture fiasco. It worried Clay. She'd looked at him and the football-loving fan like they'd lost their minds. Obviously, she hadn't liked the intrusion, but what could he do? He wouldn't snub fans of the sport. He guided his car into the lot at her apartment complex. "Sara." He shifted into neutral, cut the engine, and turned to her. "I had a wonderful time tonight. Are we still on for the movies tomorrow night?" Sara gave him a tight-lipped smile and dropped her gaze down to her lap. "I'd really like to." She shook her head. "You have no idea how much I'd really like to." She looked back at him. The words coming out of her mouth didn't match the melancholy expression on her face. "It's just not a good idea." "Why?" Clay asked. "Back at the restaurant." He dared to go there on the tip of a shaky tongue. "Before the picture." Once he'd said it, the strength in his voice returned when he added, "You were all for it." "Let's just say that a stranger asking to take a picture with you woke me up." Sara looked at Clay and frowned. Why did he do that anyway? She was trying hard to understand what was happening. It was time for Clay to come clean, at least about who he used to be. "Ever heard of the NFL?" he asked, and she answered with a blank stare. "Football?" Her eyes lit up. "Oh yes, we have football in England." "No." He shook his head and tried not to laugh at her. "The Brits play soccer. We Americans play football. It's our national pastime." "So," the word ground out slowly on her gravelly tone, "you're an athlete." "I was," he nodded. The key word here being was. I've been out of that life for 10 years. She lowered her voice to a whisper when she asked, "And that guy still knows who you are?" Clay sighed. "Well, it helps that I played on an extraordinary team. As much as he'd like to take credit where credit was due, Clay got the feeling that the more prominent he appeared to have been during his time in the NFL, the further away it would push Sara from him, and Clay didn't want that. She seemed to be thinking deeply, then said, "You said you didn't play for very long." She hadn't phrased it like a question, but it was. "My 4th year, I sustained a career-ending injury." Those words used to be so painful that he hadn't dared speak them for 4 years following the tragedy, but that was a long time ago. He could say them now with no more emotion than reading a grocery list. Sara got the feeling those words had, over the years, caused Clay more pain than he was letting on. But it didn't matter. Sara couldn't let herself forget that the press was always lurking around every corner, no matter where she was. And if she was discovered here in America, everybody in England would find out about it far too soon to suit her. "Look," she said, trying to toughen her tone. Maybe that'd somehow project to him that she meant business. "I like you, I really do. But I don't need any run-ins with the press here in the States." "What are you hiding from, Sara?" "Okay, here's the deal, and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep this to yourself." She turned to him, waiting for his confirmation. Without it, she wasn't saying another word. He nodded, and she continued. "I used to be married to, well, to who doesn't really matter. The point is that I was married to someone who is a bit of a celebrity in England. It ended badly, a very public betrayal on his part, and the press fed on it. They just wouldn't let it go. It took every ounce of composure she could muster to keep her voice calm while her heart was banging against her chest. We've been divorced for over a year now, and I still couldn't step foot outside my house in London without some reporter bringing it back front and center." Clay stayed silent for what seemed like forever. When he finally did speak, he gave her a knowing smile. "That's why you left England and came here to our quiet little town." Clay caressed her cheek with a gentle tenderness that sent chills rolling over Sara. She hadn't felt that way under a man's touch in a very long time. "You're looking for some peace of mind." She nodded. "So you see why I can't get involved with you. Not if you're going to be attracting the press. It'll only be a matter of time before they figure out who I am." She shook her head. "And that'll only lead to disaster." Clay laughed. "Darlin', I appreciate that you think so highly of me, that you think I could attract the press in such a manner, but quite frankly, it's just not true. The press couldn't care less about me. Most of them don't even know who I am," he said in a bit of a melancholy tone. But there was no regret showing on his face. Clearly, Clay had made peace with his demons. "That guy tonight, he was nothing more than a fan." "You're sure?" She wanted to believe it would be okay, and she wouldn't be discovered here. "Positive." He gave her hand a gentle caress. "That doesn't happen very often." He shook his head. "Just every once in a while some old-school fan will recognize me." He was touching her face again. She liked it. "I promise you, you're safe with me." "All right." She gave in, but still had some lingering doubts, and they escaped in her tone. "If you're sure." "To get to you," he said with a gleam in his eye, "they'll have to go through me, and everybody else in town." He gave her an easy nod. "Fireside's not gonna let the press bother you." The way he said it, the determined look on his face, Sara believed him. She reached for the car door and asked, "Do you want to come in?" He studied her for a minute before saying, "Yeah." Chapter 5. Sara woke up the next morning wrapped in Clay's arms. She hadn't intended to let it get this far, but the way he'd looked at her last night, like there was nobody else in the world but the two of them, and the way he'd vowed to protect her from the press, Sara couldn't help herself. And she wasn't sorry for it this morning either. After a few minutes in the bathroom, Clay came back into Sara's bedroom and began dressing. "Say," he said, buttoning up his Levi's, "you want to meet me at Ruby's for breakfast in about an hour?" "Sure," She sat up and pulled the sheet up to cover herself, unsure about the rate at which they seemed to be moving forward, yet unable to stop herself from charging full speed ahead. He pulled his shirt over his head and down over his torso. "I'm just gonna run home, take a quick shower, and get ready for work." He stepped forward and kissed her. "I'll see you at Ruby's." "Okay." She watched him go. Clay Darlington could give Sara everything she'd ever wanted: a normal lifestyle, no drugs, no craziness, and most of all, no public betrayals. "Do you miss England?" Clay asked Sara while stirring sugar and cream into his coffee. "I miss my mom and dad," she said, tap dancing around the reality of what it had meant to have lived there ever since she'd gotten mixed up with Kirk Bronson. "Yeah, but it's your home. It's where you were born and raised, don't you miss it?" "I miss what it used to be like," she shrugged. "Before I met and married." She let Kirk's identity trail off, unheard. Clay glanced outside and then back to her. "When I was a kid, I couldn't wait to get out of here. Then I went away to college and on to the NFL." He shrugged, but there was a distant look in his eyes. "By the time my world fell apart, I couldn't think of anything but coming back here." Why did Sara get the feeling there was more to Clay's world falling apart than a career-ending injury? "What happened?" she asked in her "I really want to know about you" voice. "Compound fracture." He shook his head like it was no big deal. "It's hard to come back from those." "Have you ever been married?" Normally, Sara wouldn't ask something like this so soon, but at the rate they seemed to be moving, she felt she had the right. "Yes," he gave an exaggerated nod. "And divorced. Right after Meredith found out she would no longer be the wife of a pro football player, she headed for the hills. And I don't mean the Sierra Nevada either." He laughed, like he was telling a joke or something, but Sara got the feeling that Clay's pride was hurting more these days than his heart. A man carried a certain look in his eyes when he talked about a woman he had feelings for. Kirk had had that look in his eyes when he talked about Roxanne, while he and Sara were still married. Too bad Sara hadn't realized that until after the fact. But Sara was certain that Clay's eyes were vacant of any lingering feelings for Meredith. This gave Sara a measure of confidence. "Maybe we should introduce your ex to mine," Sara laughed, thinking Kirk would suit Clay's ex perfectly. "Have I told you how much I love your sense of humor?" he asked. Sara's cheeks heated under his praise. "Clay?" A woman's chastising voice echoed across the diner. Sara glanced toward the door, seeing a short, petite brunette charging toward them. Uh-oh, who in the hell was this? Surely not Meredith. Barging toward them, she demanded to know, "Clay, where in the hell have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." She bumped him over with her hip, pushing him to the other side of the booth as she sat down. A younger man, probably in his mid-20s, remained standing at her side. "Mickey," Clay said with a hint of censure in his tone. This was a hell of a time for his sister to show up. "Was I supposed to meet you for breakfast? Did I forget?" She smacked him, looking at Sara, and smiled. "Hi, I'm Mickey, Clay's older sister." She reached her hand across the booth. Sara shook it. Older sister. She always had to throw that in, like it meant something. All it meant was that Mickey was going to reach the age for Social Security before him. "Mickey." Clay motioned between the two of them. "This is Sara." He looked at Sara and said, "This is my annoying sister Mickey." Clay glanced back at his sister and shot her a hard glare. "She has a way of showing up at the most inopportune times." She didn't seem affected by his words as she said, "You are coming Saturday night, right?" "Oh, come on, Mickey. You know that's not my thing." "I'm counting on you." She pushed herself up out of the booth. "Bring Sara, too." She headed for the door with her male assistant following her. 8 o'clock, she said without looking over her shoulder. "Don't be late." Clay looked at Sara and grinned. "You want to go?" She gave him an inquisitive look. "Where?" My sister's stupid party Saturday night, he shrugged. You don't seem too enthused about it, Sara said cautiously. I'm only going to go if you go. Great, Sara sighed. If you don't go, she'll blame me. So we're going then? He asked with a wink. His smile showed his dimples. Sure, she tossed him an easy nod. What's the dress code? Black tie, evening gown. He studied her for a moment and quickly decided that anybody who could lay down cash for a new Corvette could handle the price of an evening gown. If you need suggestions on where to buy a dress, I'm sure Mickey can guide you in the right direction. She shrugged. I'm sure I have something appropriate in my closet. Of course she did. Clay was starting to wonder just who this ex of hers was, and if he, Clay, could measure up. Chapter 6. Saturday morning, after Clay dropped Sara off at her apartment, she selected 4 of her favorite evening gowns from her closet and laid them out on her bed. She looked at the dresses, wondering which one Clay would like best, the blue, the black and white, the red, or the gold. She'd spent every night this week with Clay. He'd taken her to his house last night and cooked her dinner. He'd grilled steaks and baked potatoes and had a cheesecake at the ready for dessert. He lived in a beautiful house surrounded by 10 wooded acres at the end of a lane. She'd fallen in love with the house the moment she'd laid eyes on it. Of course, it helped that it came with Clay. She pulled the gold dress up against her and glanced in the mirror. She'd worn the dress to the Grammys back in '84. Kirk had said she'd brought him luck in it. Maybe it'd do the same for her tonight. That settled it. She was going to wear the gold one. Sara wasn't the superstitious sort. She had no qualms about wearing this dress tonight. She'd gotten over Kirk a long time ago, so the history of the dress mattered little to her. She grabbed the remote and switched on the television in her bedroom. She liked having the MTV channel on while she was dressing. If they played anything from Kirk's band, it made her feel good to mute the sound. As the video ended, Sara heard the VJ mention Roxanne Simon. That got Sara's attention. Oddly enough, Sara didn't hate Roxanne. Not really, even though the woman was directly responsible for the single event that ended her marriage. Sara had thought she and Kirk were happy, in a good place. Clay was starting to show her differently. Kirk had never been as attentive as Clay. He'd never made her feel quite so special as Clay had a way of doing. Well, Sara hoped that Kirk and Roxanne were happy together. She knew they'd begun an affair shortly after she and Kirk had split. But Sara also knew it was doomed. Kirk would never measure up. Roxanne Simon was madly in love with Frank Garrett. A photograph of Roxanne wrapped in the arms of the actor David Faulkner overtook the television screen. Sara sat down on the edge of her bed and grabbed the remote, turning up the volume. Reports are flying around New York City that Roxanne Simon and her latest co-star David Faulkner are involved in an off-screen romance, Tamra, the guest VJ, said. Last we heard, Roxanne and Kirk Bronson, the apparent father of her child, were giving it a go. By the look on the VJ's face, she seemed to be taking some perverse pleasure in this particular report. Our affiliates in London contacted Kirk Bronson, whose only comment was that he and Roxanne were no longer an item, but they have parted on good terms and would remain great friends. Tamara's mouth twisted into a judgmental smile. The girl gets around, doesn't she? Wow, Kirk and Roxanne were no longer together? Sara almost felt sorry for Kirk. Almost. Just not enough to really care. Sara had moved on. To Clay. Clay arrived at her house at 6:30 that evening. When she opened the door, he gasped as he took in the sight of her. He nodded and said, Wow, you look amazing. Thank you. She tried not to let her smile get out of hand. The last thing she wanted to do was grin at him like an idiot. She raked her gaze over him. You don't look so bad yourself. He laughed and reached for her hand, and they strolled toward his car. They drove to the community center, where Mickey's party was to take place. Clay let the car roll to a stop at the valet parking that Mickey had hired for the evening. A kid, maybe 20 or 21, trotted up to the passenger's side and opened the door. He offered Sara his hand and helped her out. Quickly, he trotted around to Clay, who had already stepped out of the car. Clay walked the kid around the vehicle, pointing out that there was not a scratch on it, and it had better be returned to him in the same condition. After Clay knocked a good year off the kid's life, he ambled up to Sara, letting a smile touch the edge of his mouth. Clay offered her his arm and escorted her inside. Mickey and a tall, handsome man of about 40, whose dark hair had begun to gray at the temples, were waiting by a set of opened double doors. When Clay and Sara stopped in front of them, Sara peeked inside and saw a lavishly decorated ballroom. "Mickey?" Clay kissed his sister's cheek, then turned to the guy at her side. "Justin," he said as they shook hands. If Clay was on a first-name basis with him, was he perhaps Mickey's husband? Of course, neither Mickey nor Justin were wearing wedding rings. Sara didn't take Mickey for the no-rings type. Most likely a boyfriend or a close friend. "Sara!" Mickey grabbed her hand. "I'm so glad you could join us, and I must say..." She eyed Sara with a peculiar interest. "You do dress my brother up with class." Mickey ended her declaration with a little giggle, but Sara got the feeling she was still studying her. Why? Sara didn't know. "Very funny," Clay said to Mickey in a dry tone. He looked at her friend. "Justin, this is Sara." Justin smiled at Sara, shaking her hand. "Aren't you the new reporter over at the paper?" She nodded. "Yes, I am." "Harvey is my uncle," Justin said. "He speaks highly of you. Says you take great pictures." Sara glanced away shyly, unsure about what to say. She wasn't used to all these compliments. In her experience, those had been reserved for Kirk, her rock star ex-husband. This was new. Sara liked it. "I'm glad to hear that." Clay placed his hand against the small of her back, snuggling her closer to him. "She's promised to take some pictures of my car." "You and that car!" Mickey shook her head. "I swear." She looked at Sara and raised her eyebrows. "Men, what are you gonna do?" Sara shrugged. "Can't live with 'em, can't live without 'em." "Lord, don't I know it!" Mickey laughed and slapped Justin against his chest. Clay peered over his shoulder, then back at Mickey. "Are we at your table?" She nodded. "Sara's sitting beside me." He grabbed Sara's hand. "Do I at least get to sit on her other side?" Mickey smacked Clay playfully and nudged him into the ballroom, while she and Justin remained at the door to greet the rest of the partygoers. Sara touched up her lipstick before leaving the restroom and returning to the table where she'd found herself sitting with Fireside's elite. It seemed like the entire town was there, and she was extremely proud to be Clay's date. Then she found out she was at a fundraiser. Mickey was running for state legislature, which Clay had explained was a little like Parliament. She left the restroom and walked down the short corridor that opened up into the ballroom. She barely had time to sit back down at the table when someone walked up and said something about pictures. Sara's heart thudded against her chest. Would these photographs show up in the paper? Any picture of her that got published in any newspaper could find its way to the AP wire, especially a photograph of her in a gown she wore to the Grammys 3 years ago. For the first time tonight, Sara realized that wearing this dress had been a mistake. Mickey stood and waved at Clay and Sara. "Clay, you and Sara come join us." Clay folded his arms over his chest. "You go ahead." He shook his head. "This is about you, sis, not us." Mickey looked at Sara. "I'd be honored if you'd join me in the pictures." "Clay's right," Sara said. "This is about you. You go ahead." Mickey looked exceptionally disappointed as she backed away from the table and headed out, but Sara couldn't worry about that. She had to keep a low profile, especially in this dress. "Thank you," Sara whispered to Clay as Mickey and her entourage moved away from the table. "Well, I know how important it is for you to fly under the radar. It was definitely a statement, but something in his tone suggested it was open-ended. Clay had given Sara a clear opening to tell him more about this past that she was trying so hard to conceal. Yet, when she didn't say anything, but instead started fidgeting, Clay added, "You want to dance?" She nodded and smiled eagerly. Clay led her to the dance floor, thinking about what Mickey had told him while Sara was in the restroom. He'd scoffed at Mickey when she'd told him that Sara was Sara Bronson, ex-wife of the rock star Kirk Bronson. But Mickey seemed so certain. She said she'd thought there was something familiar about Sara when he had introduced them at Ruby's diner the other morning. But after seeing her in this evening gown tonight, Mickey was 100% sure where she knew her from. If there was one thing Clay could give Mickey credit for, that was keeping up with fashion. Mickey didn't care a bit about who won what awards, but she never missed a red carpet show. She always watched to see what everyone was wearing, even though she'd turn the program off once the cameras went inside the venue. Mickey had been adamant that she'd seen Sara in the same dress she was wearing this evening a few years ago at the Grammys, which she'd attended with her then-husband, Kirk Bronson. As Clay slow danced Sara around the dance floor, he held her tight, wanting to remember every second of the time he'd spent with her. He'd heard people talk about love at first sight. He'd never thought it possible, but here he was with this newfound thought of not being quite enough for Sara, and it was killing him. He didn't think she harbored any leftover feelings for Kirk, though. At least, she didn't seem like it. She'd convinced Clay that she was quite over her ex, and he believed her. But the kind of lifestyle Kirk had provided was a lot to live up to, and something Clay could never deliver. "You know," he whispered against her ear, "this is about the best that I could ever do for you." He sucked in a breath and continued on with his bid for approval. "A quiet, simple life here in Fireside. My sister'll throw a party like this every once in a while, and we'll be invited." Clay was overwhelmed with feelings of inadequacy, a totally foreign concept to him. Mickey's parties will be about the most glamorous thing I'll ever be able to deliver. "This is all I've ever wanted," she said so softly he barely heard her. Chapter 7. The next morning, Clay had been quiet the entire drive over to drop Sara off at her place. For some reason, he'd clammed up at the party and she wanted to know why. "I had fun last night," she said, hoping to get him talking again. "During or after the party?" He looked at her and grinned. "Both," she said with a grin, "but especially afterwards." Rolling into the parking lot of her apartment complex, he shifted into neutral and reached for her, tucking her hair behind her ear. "I'm working the next 3 nights. You want to come over for dinner on Thursday?" He hesitated, then smiled. "I'd like that." He leaned toward her and laid a kiss on her that devoured her mouth. "If we're slow, I'll call you." Sara pushed herself to open the car door and step out. She hurried to her door and glanced over her shoulder as she inserted the key into the lock. Clay's red Corvette was pulling out onto the street. She thought she saw him waving behind the tinted window just before he floored it and zipped out of sight. Hours later, just before Sara sat down to eat dinner, her phone rang. "Hello?" she said into the receiver. "Hey, it's me." Clay's voice flowed across the wire. "Hey." Sara smiled to herself and sat down at the dining table. "How are things at the fire and rescue?" "Lonely." "Lonely? Aren't there a ton of guys there with you?" "They're boring." Sara laughed. "I've been thinking," Clay said. "About?" "I don't think I can wait until Thursday to see you." "No?" Her breath caught in her throat. Clay was sounding like himself again, before whatever had happened at the party last night had turned him off. "Let's have dinner tomorrow evening before I go to work," he suggested. "Your place or mine?" He was silent for a moment, then said, "My place." He delivered a devilish chuckle. That way you can spend the night and wait for me when I get home Thursday morning. I like the sound of that, she said, but I have to go to work Tuesday. You can be a little late, he said. Harvey won't mind. You're a bad influence, she said behind a chuckle. You know that, don't you? I'll make it worth your while, he said enticingly. Tempting. The timer on the stove went off. My dinner's ready to come out of the oven. Go eat. I'll talk to you later. An hour later, Sara had finished dinner and cleaned up the kitchen. She'd spent so much time with Clay this past week that she wasn't quite sure what to do with herself now that he was at work. She strolled into the living room and picked up the television guide she'd pulled out of the Sunday paper and left on the coffee table for reference. She checked it to see if there was anything on this evening. A firm knock at the door tore into her thoughts. Sara tossed the guide back onto the coffee table and went for the door. She tried to guess who it might be, but had no luck. Clay was at work. Peering through the peephole, she said, "What the?" Stepping back, she yanked open the door. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Sara." Kirk sighed and relief tipped the corners of his mouth. "I was beginning to think I'd never find you." He reached for her. She stepped back, away from him. "What the hell are you doing here?" she asked again, more forceful this time. "Looking for you." Sara motioned him inside. "Did anybody see you? Recognize you?" That'd be disastrous. If anyone recognized Kirk, it would only be a matter of time before Sara's true identity came out. Once that happened, her quiet and solitude, as well as her budding relationship with Clay, was shot to hell. "What's with you, Sara?" Kirk smiled, but his voice was shaky. "Since when have you ever cared what people think?" Sara slammed the door. "Since the press won't leave me alone." She stomped back toward the living room. "Forget about the press, Sara." Kirk dropped to her side on the couch. "Come back to England with me." He reached for her hands. "Are you nuts?" She yanked her hands back. "What makes you think I'd do something stupid like that?" "We never should have divorced, Sara." Sara nodded. "Uh-huh. I see what this is about." She poked an accusatory finger at Kirk's chest. "Roxanne dumped you." She let out an exasperated sigh and pushed herself up from the couch. "Come on." She waggled her hand at him. He took it and smiled, rising to stand beside her. "I am so not in the mood for this." She led him to the door, opened it, and glared at him. "Sara," he shook his head. "We made a huge mistake." "Boy, did we ever." She nodded and pushed him outside. "We never should have got married in the first place," she added, before slamming the door on him. It was an epiphany that had smacked her right in the face. Marrying Kirk Bronson was something that never should have happened. Chapter 8. Last night, Sara had shown Kirk to the door with no regrets. There was no place for him in her life now. There was only room for Fireside and Clay, and not necessarily in that order. She was going to tell Clay tonight exactly who she was and what it'd mean if the press found out she was here. As she drove herself to Clay's house after work, she practiced her speech. "Clay, there's something I have to tell you." Yes, that was a good start. "Remember that ex-husband I was telling you about?" Sara coached herself. "Why, yes, Sara. Why do you keep bringing him up? Is this thing between you two not over?" Ugh. Sara let out an exaggerated sigh. God, Clay would never be that insecure. Definitely not. Clay was far too full of himself to be threatened by another man. But what about a rock star? Could he feel threatened by a rock star? Sara was just going to have to make sure that he wasn't. She pulled into Clay's driveway and parked next to the fire and rescue truck he drove. Sara got out of the car and went to the front door. It opened before she could knock. Clay pulled her inside, into his arms, and planted a slow, smoldering kiss on her. "I thought you'd never get here," he said, closing the door. "We have to talk," she said, trying to project her seriousness onto him. "On an empty stomach?" He chuckled. "Look, I just need to tell you some things, and then if you still want to, we can eat." "Okay." He tugged her into the living room and guided her down onto the couch. "Tell me what it is that you think is so important." He was indulging her, as if she were in a fragile state of mind, but she didn't care. She was going to tell him her secret before somebody else did. "It's who I was back in England." She shook her head. "No matter what we do, it's always going to be a dark cloud hanging over us." "I don't care who you were in England," he said. "I only care about who you are now." "Yeah, well," she rolled her eyes, "you might feel differently when you learn the truth." "I know the truth." He gave her a long, searching look. "Now, the only way this could turn out to be a problem is if you're still in love with him." "I'm not," she said emphatically. "I realized that last night." She lowered her gaze right along with her tone. "When he showed up at my door." "What?" Clay shouted with a growl of caged fury. "He was here? What happened?" "Nothing. I tossed him out." She shook her head. "But that doesn't change the fact that if he can find me, so can the press." She gave a helpless shrug. "Once they do, they'll make your life and everybody else's in town a living hell." "We have our ways of dealing with unwanted visitors here in Fireside." He laughed devilishly. "Is it legal?" she asked, half serious. A smile tipped the corners of Clay's mouth. Then he pulled her to him and kissed her. "You do make a good case for your argument," she said, finally feeling like she could relax a little. "So you were married to that idiot, Kirk Bronson," he said, and it wasn't really a question. "Idiot, huh?" She laughed. "You know him pretty well." "Not really," Clay shrugged. "But I do know this. Only an idiot would let you get away." "It's just as well." Sara shook her head. "He can't compare to you." "His loss is my gain," Clay said. "But you might want to contact him one last time." "Why's that?" "To give him fair warning," Clay said. "Next time he shows up here in Fireside, he'll answer to me." Epilogue. 6 months later. Most mornings, Sara and Clay dropped into Ruby's diner first thing in the morning. While she was usually going to work, he could be coming or going, as he sometimes worked the night shift. They always sat at the counter, and today, Clay watched her as she slid off the stool and headed for the restroom. Jewel stepped up to Clay and poured coffee into his cup. "Times are kind of boring around here, Clay. When are you going to give us something to look forward to?" "What do you mean?" He chuckled as if her inquiry made him nervous. "You know what I mean." She tossed him a chastising look and turned away. "Doesn't Mickey bring you enough gossip from Sacramento?" he asked, pointing out that his sister, who had recently been elected to the state legislature, should be the talk of the town. Not him. Jewel turned back around and leaned on the counter. "You think you're funny, don't you?" "Keep it down, will you?" Clay winked at Jewel. "You'll ruin my surprise." She gave him a rough glare. "Don't mess around and lose that girl, Clay." The bell jingled over the door at the front of the cafe, claiming Clay and Jewel's attention. Clay didn't recognize the guy walking in, and he doubted Jewel did either. The stranger was wearing a dress shirt and slacks. He glanced around the diner and stepped toward the counter, handing Jewel a picture. "I'm looking for this woman." Jewel looked at the picture, then passed it off to Clay. "Sara," Jewel said. "Can't say that I know her. Who is she?" "Her name's Sara Bronson." "Never heard of her," Jewel said. "She might be going by the name Sara Robbins," the stranger said. Jewel shook her head and gazed around the diner. Anybody here know a Sarah Bronson or Sarah Robbins? Everyone shook their heads. The guy pulled a card out of his pocket and handed it to Jewel. If you see her. Jewel looked at the card, then stuck it in her apron pocket. The guy dipped his chin and backed away, heading for the door. Damn reporters, Jewel said under her breath as he left the diner. Sara returned from the restroom, checking her watch as she sat back down on the stool next to Clay. I should be going soon. I don't want to be late for work. You can't go yet, Jewel said. Why not? Sara glanced at Jewel, then Clay. There was a reporter in here just now looking for you. Clay said like it was no big deal. What? Sara asked weakly. How do you know he was looking for me? Sarah Bronson, he shrugged, also known as Sarah Robbins. Don't worry about it, Jewel said. We told him we've never heard of you. The entire diner corroborated Jewel's story with nodding heads and a few yeahs. Sara gazed around the diner, awed, amazed, and appreciative for what the people of Fireside were willing to do to protect her. Clay leaned toward her and whispered, I told you we take care of our own here. You guys are adopting me? A Brit? She laughed. Nah, Jewel shrugged. We're letting you in by marriage. Marriage? Sara got this confused look on her face. Thanks a lot, Jewel, Clay grumbled. I told you not to ruin my surprise. Well, if you'd just go ahead and ask her to marry you. Jewel gestured elaborately at Sara, giving Clay a look that said she was growing tired of waiting on him. Clay turned to Sara and shrugged. Come outside with me? He asked, offering his hand. Sara studied Clay for a moment. Was this his idea or Jewel's? Maybe he was trying to make a break for it. As his lover, she should help him. She took the hand he offered and followed him outside to his fire and rescue truck. He opened the passenger door and nudged her inside. She sat with her feet dangling off the side of the seat. Well, like I've already told you. He raked his hand across his forehead anxiously. Was he nervous? A simple life here in Fireside is about the best I can ever do for you. She nodded, feeling a sudden elation curling the corners of her mouth. I have no grand gestures up my sleeve, just a simple declaration. He dropped down on one knee and fished the little jewelry box from his pocket. Sarah Robbins, I'll love you forever. He opened the box. Marry me and make me the luckiest man on earth. She sucked in a breath and felt the tears coming as her eyes began to water. Yes, she nodded and fell into his arms. Yes, of course I'll marry you. Clay kissed her, and she knew. Sarah Renee Robbins, formerly Bronson, had finally found her song. This has been Sarah's Song, Crazy for You, Book 2. Written by Sandra Edwards. Narrated by Desiree Brajevich. Copyright 2013 by Sandra Edwards. Production copyright 2015 by Sandra Edwards.